If you've been around for more than a few months, you might know by now that nearly 3 months ago I was hired as the lead of the southern region of the Unitarian Universalist Association. Have I mentioned this to you? I'm glad you laughed. I at first accepted that position, then about a month later I withdrew my acceptance. I felt the job became untenable when a person of color who also applied for the job shared on Facebook that she felt my hire and her not being hired was an example of systemic racism, especially since it would mean that with my hire, all 5 of the regional leads would be white. The outcry around that resulted in the resignation of the UUA president, the chief operations officer, and the director of congregational life, the person who hired me. Now, as you might imagine, I have strong feelings about all that. I share the goal of true empowerment of people of color at every level of our movement, including the highest levels of the Unitarian Universalist Association. Still, it stunned me that not a single conversation was had with me before the public statements were made. It hurt my family. It continues to affect us as a congregation. I am sorry for that. And yet I'm also incredibly grateful to you all for having me back after I resigned. And these last few weeks I'm remembering just how much I love serving with you the city that we call home and all the little burbs too. I'm so moved by all the support you all have given us. But I'm not here to talk about my feelings this morning. This morning, I want to add some depth to the way we religious liberals talk about race by including the intersection of social class. Though I don't agree with the approach that's being taken in addressing the concern at the national level of our movement, this much is a fact. We are a mostly white association. In fact, Unitarian Universalism is white beyond the percentage of white people in the wider culture. But I came to believe as I was finishing my doctoral dissertation last summer that we Unitarian Universalists are, and American religion in general is, stuck at the intersection of race and social class. And here we have sat for a long, long time. Back in 1929, Richard Niebuhr wrote a book titled The Social Sources of Denominationalism. Basically, Niebuhr protested the many divisions in American Protestant Christianity. He saw the hundreds of denominations in the United States as evidence of the failure of Christianity to live up to the ideals of justice and equality preached by Jesus. All these people claiming to follow a preacher of love couldn't find a way to worship together in spite of theological disagreements. This grieved Richard Niebuhr. He saw American people of faith as divided up in our houses of worship along lines, pretty clearly, along lines of social class. His argument, which was based on the argument of an earlier sociologist and theologian, Max Weber, went something like this. The Puritans who came to America were Calvinists who believed God had chosen people to be damned and people to go to heaven. Before they were born, God chose where they would spend eternity. Since there was nothing then that people could do to participate in their own salvation or lack thereof, they looked for signs that they were among the chosen. One sign that a person was going to the good place and not the bad place was worldly success. If a person made good money, and to give Calvin credit, if they used it in positive ways, that was probably a sign that they were among the elect. This is the rise of the Protestant work ethic, the drive to prove one's chosen by God status. Now, a good number of those Puritans became Unitarians. Did you know you were a 21st century Puritan? In Unitarianism and in American culture in general, as God was sort of removed from the center of that work to show I'm good equation, Proof of a person's goodness by their worldly success kind of stuck around in our movement and in lots of other liberal religious movements. The 17th and 18th centuries were, for our religious ancestors, what Niebuhr called, quote, a slow process of accommodation to the developing interests and experiences of a rising economic group, end quote. Unitarian faith was increasingly made up of upper middle class people, and so it increasingly represented the interests of the upper middle class. There are fascinating reasons that all that happened, and if you want a link to my dissertation, I will send it to you. It has cured insomnia for several people already. So Niebuhr looked at the landscape of American religion, again back in 1929, and saw what he called religions of the disinherited and religions of the bourgeois, or what we might call the upper middle class. Upper middle class religions were marked by intellectualism and by high church forms of worship, whereas Niebuhr said religions of the poor and disinherited were more emotional, more passionate, I would say. Studies were done later that bore out some of Niebuhr's hunches about how we were grouped. Sociologists, as recently as 2006, have measured social class in American religion. Mainly, they measure four things. There's income, wealth, the money that you've accumulated and held on to, if that's possible, I know. So, income, wealth, education, and job prestige, which is an old scale that assigns weight to jobs in our culture that bring you sort of cultural power. How much cultural power, how much social class status does your job bring? Unitarian Universalism, on every one of those scales, was either first or second. Just as Niebuhr saw things in 1929, they were found to be in the 2000s. At or near the bottom of all of those measures, for nearly the last century, are denominations that are primarily people of color. I think this is likely because people of color, and often the poor and working class too, and the intersections of those groups, have historically been denied power and access in our culture. This is where race and religion intersect. But there's a piece of this that's even more complicated. So we all have our ratings on this scale. And we tend in American religion to group ourselves according to, sort of, the social class that we're in. There's a fifth measure of social class that's harder to quantify. There's a French sociologist who talked about it. Think of an animal habitat. Animals need certain things to survive. Some species need tall grass and warm water, so they seek out those things and are most comfortable in those surroundings. When we gather in our houses of worship, we tend to work together to create a certain social class habitat. The music we choose, the kind of sermons we preach and prefer to listen to, the subjects we study together in religious education classes, but also the conversations that we have during coffee hour after the service. Do we talk a lot about international travel? Do we talk a lot about football? Those mark us. What kind of movies do most of us tend to talk about? That marks us too. And it's not bad, of course, to be of any social class. But it does make it hard, whichever group we're in, for people of other social classes who prefer a different kind of habitat to break into ours. If we are too centered on the predominant characteristics, the predominant habitat preferences of the social class majority. Historically, once a religion's social class status has been established, it has not moved very far, if it's moved at all. Racial identity intersects there because in our culture we've also discriminated by skin color, who will get power and who will not. And this is what social class is, a measure of how much power and access to control we have in our culture. inarguably, there are systems developed over centuries of oppression of people of color and the poor, which privilege whiteness and middle-class status. That's true both specifically in our movement, a little wider in American religion, and in American culture in general. And breaking down those systems is incredibly complex. I can't remember the source, but I read recently that systemic racism does not require racists to operate. And I think that's right. In too many ways, racism is ingrained in our processes and in our culture. And yet, my opinion as always, if we're not careful to stay in relationship with one another as we do the work of dismantling those systems, we start to make assumptions. There is a form of racism which seems to be unique to liberals, in which white people say, we must follow the lead of people of color in dismantling racism. But we fail to realize or talk about that there is no unified voice of people of color any more than there is a unified voice of white people or any other group. Better to say, I think, that we will be in relationships of accountability as we do the work. We must resist the urge to oversimplify in search of quick results. Personal story illustrates, I think, how complicated the intersection of race and social class really is. Sometimes when I'm not in the pulpit here, I like to attend worship at Pilgrim's Rest, a big, historically black Baptist church in the city. Now, you would not peg me as wanting to attend worship there just by looking at me. But I was raised Pentecostal and working class. We Pentecostals were what Niebuhr called a religion of the disinherited. We had a religion of the disinherited social habitat, and we shared a whole lot of practices with Pilgrim Rest, including often the preaching style, certainly including the music, even the way people walk in and out of a building. And so sometimes I just go and sit and cry tears of joy up at Pilgrim Rest because, friends, while I do love us, those songs and that style, they're just in me, and I still cherish them. They connect me to the holy in a way that nothing else does. It is deeply, deeply complicated. The truth is this: even as we group ourselves predictably along lines of social class and along lines of color, no congregation is ever completely one or another, one group or another. There is always, always present a diversity of people, a diversity of social classes, a diversity of ethnicities. Diversity is always present. So here we sit, Unitarian Universalists, primarily white, but certainly not all white, predominantly middle and upper middle class, but not entirely so, seeking greater diversity in social class, in race, in ethnicity. How on God's green earth will we ever move forward? I was asking you. I don't have the answer, but I'll tell you one thing I know, as sure as I know the sun will come up in the morning. We will not solve this in a moment. We will not solve this in a weekend. We will not solve this in a worship service. We won't solve this as individuals. We will grow in diversity, and we will change our white people-centered and upper middle class-centered ways of being only in relationship. We will only make progress as we can sit down across from one another, look into the eyes of someone to whom we are committed, tell our truths, and listen to the truths of the loved ones across from us. Change will require us to stay at the table and to actively participate through our discomfort. Now, within limits, of course. Abuse should never be tolerated. But outside of abuse, if we're serious about diversity, we'll have to commit to staying in covenant with one another, not leaving because we're uncomfortable at being asked to change how we think about something, no matter who we are. We'll have to remember that being in a congregation with someone requires difficult conversations. Stay after service today to pick up some skills and practice them. And as covenant-based people, my opinion, I think we have to give preference in our social justice work to practices that make space for people who disagree to stay at the table. Because we are not just a social justice not-for-profit. We're a faith movement rooted deeply in the principle that all people have worth and dignity, springing historically from Jewish and Christian sources that call us into relationship and sacrificial love. We have a particular way of being with one another. And if we are willing to simply sacrifice relationship and covenant, then I think we're doing something else than Unitarian Universalism. Covenant theology requires us to use justice tactics that keep us in relationship, even if trends in the wider culture are luring us to behave in some other way. The revolution will not occur on Facebook. In this congregation, we've been talking about and going about working on race in a very particular way, rooted and grounded in Unitarian Universalism. We've been forming relationships with groups mainly made up of people of color, including the East Valley NAACP, that's led in part by local African Methodist Episcopal church leaders, with whom we've also been developing relationships. As your representative, I've worked to form relationships within Puente, Arizona, some of you have too, and other immigrant justice groups. We've also been forming relationships in the Arizona Faith Network and Valley Interfaith Project, getting us to the table with people of other faith traditions, including Muslims and other oppressed religious groups. We work with the city of Chandler to house our homeless neighbors, reaching across lines of social class and cultural acceptance. It takes a long time, but the relationships we build in this kind of work are lasting if we maintain them, and we will. Just a few weeks ago, a neighbor within walking distance of this congregation, a black man, told me his story. As a 6-year-old, he and his family took a trip from Illinois, where he lived, to the Deep South, where for the first time he came across Jim Crow and segregated water fountains. He said he remembered thinking that if only white people can drink that water, there must be something really special about it. So he crept over to the white water fountain and took a drink. And before he could finish his drink, a white man yanked him away from the fountain and whacked him on the back of the head. He has known discrimination all his life. I asked him if I could tell this story, and he said absolutely. Recently, he had been out with a friend who lived in Mesa, and our neighbor was taking his friend home to his gated community. As our neighbor was pulling out of that community, he was pulled over by a police officer. He asked the officer, "Why did you pull me over?" And the officer said, "You just don't look like you're from around here." They made him blow into a breathalyzer twice and found nothing, so they drew his blood and found that although he was way below the legal limit, he had had a drink that night, which technically can be criminal. His fine was multiple thousands of dollars. And after some research, he learned that if he challenged it, the legal fees on top of the fine, if he lost, would be more than he could afford. Work on that kind of racism is connected to work on the systems in our congregation and in our association. All these systems that privilege whiteness and middle-class status, when they become visible, it becomes our work to dismantle them, to tell the stories, to be public, however we can. Because in our culture and in our faith movement, in every American faith movement, there are old patterns that privilege whiteness and punish people of color and the poor. Systemic racism is insidious. It is persistent. We must be just as persistent. So let us together never cease the work of dismantling race and class prejudice wherever we find them, and let us do that work together. Amen.